I want to look at two very different types of palm trees. The first one is perhaps the most typical, with a massive fronds coming out from a central point. The biggest problem I see with palm trees is when they're drawn more from memory and from preconceptions of what a palm tree looks like than what's actually in front. And we end up with something looking fairly cartoon-like. And there's also the feeling that if we were to look down on this palm tree, it would look pretty much a flat 180-degree shape. That we're seeing all of these palm fronds straight on. There isn't usually in the drawing a sense of this palm tree is a 360-degree affair with palm fronds coming out in all directions. So, as always, before we start drawing, it's worth a look to see exactly what things do we need to capture. And particularly being aware of this, we need to look at what are the shapes of the palm fronds. And even though we know that palm fronds have this jagged tooth-like effect, when we look at this palm tree, and certainly from the distance we're looking at it from, it's as if these toothy leaves on the frond are more of one solid unit. That's more the effect, with some indication of shadow indicating the separate leaves on the frond. We can see that some of them are dead and hang down quite loosely, quite limply. We can see that the ones up the top curve over slightly at the tip, so we get a rounded effect. But ones that are coming straight out at us are the ones that look the most different. If we take this one, it's looking something like this, and then it bends down behind that into the heart of the tree. This one here is looking more like this. The ones that are on the side, that we are really looking more side on at, they branch out something like this. Whereas other ones that we're looking more 3/4 on end up giving a somewhat more complex shape. What we don't have is a mass of fronds that all really look the same. It will be the way we draw the fronds that will create this pom-pom, this starburst effect. This is almost like a firework going off. The most important ones will be these silhouette ones, because they're the ones that will stand out the most clearly. So let's draw it. This palm tree took 15 minutes to draw in real time. I'm starting with this central area and making some effort to capture the different shapes. This is the area where there is most variation in the way these fronds are looking as they come straight out at us and then start to angle away at more like 45 degrees. I kept thinking of peeling a banana at this stage. The other important thing to do while we're establishing some of the more exactly represented fronds is to get the scale of the overall tree worked out. Work out how far the fronds are going to come out on each side, on the top and on down the bottom. It's always harder to get the scale consistent when we've only drawn a smaller part. It's quite normal for me at this stage to find that some of my first fronds have been drawn too large or too small, and that won't matter if most of them are in the right scale. So I'm particularly looking at the overall shape as I'm drawing these ones now. I'm not so much worried about exactness of my reference as capturing the feel of the shape and the proportions of the shape and the profile of the shape. And then basically I'm filling in any gaps that I think need to be filled in. So as I said, it's not about copying the photo exactly at this point. It's about getting the overall shape of the whole tree correct. So having done that, I can now work on using my pen for the shadows and for any further details I want to put on the fronds. Now, they're certainly are some details I can put on some of the fronds to create a slightly jagged effect on some of the edges, but also to separate out some of those individual leaf-like structures that come off a frond. But mostly I'm doing shadow and shade in this. This is always a bit nervous, doing this sort of thing at the start, because until we get enough lines and create enough shadow, it's hard to know whether we're doing a good thing for our drawing or a bad thing for our drawing. And particularly because this is a fairly small subject to use a 0.5mm pen for. It's a heavier line than I would normally use, but my 0.3mm pen didn't really have enough ink left in it, I felt. So I've gone for the heavier line and the heavier look. Now at this point I want to define the trunk and to get a sense of the texture of the trunk as well, which is pocked by the fronds that have fallen off it that create an almost rough, jagged, brick-like look of broken chunks of half bricks and things all stacked on each other. And it is very dark, and I think it's a lovely balance to the effect of the light on the fronds, and it helps give a sense of the overall sun in the sky position. So I put a bit of time into the trunk, and now I come back that I've established that lower shadow on the trunk to finish the leaves and to add a bit more thickness to our pom-pom of fronds. So at this point I'm really fine-tuning, doing some lines, looking back, thinking, does it need anything else? It's important not to overwork the drawing at this point and to put too much in and to remove the gaps that we have between some fronds. And then I'm done. Now we'll look at our second palm, where the fronds have a very different shape, a very different feel that we want to capture. And here we have it. I'll draw this palm on the left, but the one on the right-hand side is useful because it shows more clearly in silhouette something of the structure of this palm. We have large paddle-shaped fronds, not long narrow ones, but the outer third to a half of these fronds ends up splitting into these very long trailing ribbon-like pieces which hang and blow in the wind. And we can see here the effect that we get with these wispy trailing pieces of palm frond, which creates a different effect if it hangs downwards and curls down, or if that particular frond is growing upwards and these shredded sections aren't as weather beaten. We can see that while a lot of this is taken up with these paddle-shaped fronds, they don't completely hide what's happening underneath. And we can see in different places, particularly here, the stems of the fronds. If we look carefully here, we can also see them here. And when we look at some fronds, such as this one here, the effect is something like this. And one of the challenges in drawing something which is made of lots of parts that structurally are all very similar is we end up drawing them all the same. Creating irregularities from frond to frond is an important part of creating a realistic looking palm tree. So we're going to draw this one now, which has a long, narrower trunk. This particular palm is local to the Sydney region, and it really only survived in a couple of very inaccessible small coves that were very steep and difficult to access. It's great that we've still got them. So let's draw this one now. And this palm tree also took 15 minutes to draw. I start with this central leaf on the palm on the left-hand side, the one that captures the light most fully, because this will be my, if you like, defining frond on this particular tree. This will be the outline, the shape, the effect that I hope the brain will carry along with the silhouette edges of the palm to create understanding of exactly what this palm tree is. Again, having established that central frond, I'm trying to work out exactly where the outer edges will be. Because once I've got those in place and I'm happy with the scale that I'm creating with the outside perimeter of this circle, then I can relax a little bit more and concentrate on the effect and the textures and the shade and shadow contrast with light without having to worry about shape and scale. Nothing's worse than putting a lot of effort into drawing some of the detail of a tree structure such as this and discovering that a quarter of the tree is in effect much smaller than the 3/4 of the tree that was drawn at the same time. So looking back and getting a sense of, is this outer edge as far out from the center as I want it to be as the other edges are? Or do I need to push it out a bit more, or is it a bit far? So I need to perhaps push some other edges out a bit more to balance the fact, to in effect make the canopy a little bit larger to compensate for having gone out too far with this particular frond. But I'm happy with the way this is working out, and capturing this hanging, this jagged, shaggy hanging effect is pretty key in these Sydney cabbage palms. And then the fact that they layer over each other, particularly at the base where they, once they start to die, drop down and hang against each other and against the base. A very different trunk to the one that we saw in the first palm. So again, you can see me trying to establish now, how far do these hanging fronds need to come? Does that work with the scale I've got? Do I need to make some adjustments to fronds I've already drawn? Do I need to make them a little bit larger? In some cases I did. And am I keeping an overall rounded shape? I decided my top here was a little bit flat, a little bit squared off. So I added a bit in the center just to give it a slightly more rounded profile. And now I'm also starting to think about tonal values, about dark and light. I probably didn't quite establish the darks as dark as I would have liked looking back now. I'm also trying to capture the texture of the trunks. Always avoid doing two straight lines for the trunk on a palm tree such as this, unless that really is the silhouette, unless that really is the profile. Some loose, jagged lines, dotted lines, dashed lines create a far more realistic effect, especially when there's tonal value differences to be placed in patterns on the actual trunk itself. Again, two straight lines looks very cartoony. And then this palm tree is done as well. So here we have our very different second palm tree, the Sydney cabbage palm. Very different palms to look at. As always, we need to pay particular attention to the silhouettes of the objects that we draw, because those lines stand out more, and therefore the brain grabs them more easily and more heavily to get information about what is this that we're looking at. And with both of these palms, it's not about an exact copy, it's about creating the effect that we're seeing, creating the effect of a massive fronds coming out from a central point that come out in 360 degrees. And while I drew a few of the fronds from both palm trees from the reference carefully, much of what I did was simply repeating the sort of patterns and types of lines, types of marks that I was making as randomly as I could. And if we establish a few spots that have quite characteristic representations of this particular palm tree or any object for that matter, then the brain can focus on that and see it in the more tangled parts of our drawing. The biggest problem I think in drawing palms is that basically we remember cartoon-like palm tree drawings, and that triggers a drawing style which is more reflective of a cartoon palm tree than an actual one. We need to look at the actual palm tree we're looking at. I've posted both of these reference photos on my community page. So why not print them off and have a go, seeing if you can capture something of the essence of each of these two very different palms. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. I really hope you give these a go, but whatever you're drawing, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.